Hey everyone, it's low-carb and keto nutritionist Amy Berger from 2itnutrition.com bringing you keto without the crazy. I wanted to do a little follow-up to my previous video celebrating and singing the praises of the late, great Dr. Robert Atkins. Before we get into things, as usual, all the business will be down below, lots of links. Links to where you can meet me in person, links to information on doing a private consultation with me, and do remember our super fun keto retreat in beautiful coastal North Carolina in the town of Beaufort. That's Dr. Westman's keto retreat. Link is down below. And all right, let's go. So this is kind of a little part 2 to my previous video because as usual, even though the video was an hour long, there's some stuff that I wouldn't say I forgot to say, but after watching the video again myself, I realized, I want to clarify some things and bring in some other stuff to show you. Okay, so if you didn't watch my previous video celebrating this man and his work, go do so immediately. It really, in my own opinion, is one of the most important videos I've ever done. And I've been doing videos for over a year now, which is not that long, but it's long enough that if I say I think that was one of my most important videos, it's one of my most important videos. So, Dr. Atkins' New Diet Revolution, Dr. Atkins' Vitanutrient Solution, Dr. Atkins' Health Revolution. We've got lots of great Dr. Atkins books. But I did not mean to give the impression in that video that Dr. Atkins was the only person talking about low carb, higher fat, higher protein diets in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. He wasn't. He was my introduction to the carbohydrate restricted way of eating, but certainly he's not where I stopped, and he's not where a lot of other people started. And, Dr. Atkins' own work built upon the research of others going back at least until the 1960s, probably at least until the 17 or 1800s. Now, in the books that I've read of his, he was citing medical and scientific research from as far back as the 40s and 50s because there were researchers doing this. He wasn't relying on what other doctors were doing. He wasn't relying on, well, what are the American Heart Association guidelines? Remember I said last time he was a cardiologist. He wasn't just towing the party line. He wasn't just saying, what do all my colleagues think? What does the government think? He didn't care. He was like, what does the human body tell us? What does human anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry, what do those things say about what I should eat and how a person might go about losing weight or how a person might go about reversing heart disease or resolving diabetes, type 2. So that is really, that's key, that he did not just follow blindly. He went directly to what's called the primary literature, went to the medical research. But he cites a number of people. I did mention Joseph Kraft, and you know what? I totally forgot. I have to go get Dr. Kraft's book off my bookshelf. I'll be right back. Okay, because I forgot that I wanted to show you all of these books. Remember I mentioned Dr. Kraft last time. This is his book, Diabetes, Epidemic, and You. You can see it's a skinny little thing. You could read this in mere hours. And so, Dr. Atkins, I think a lot of his understanding about insulin was built on the research that he read and on the work of Dr. Kraft, who I think was researching this at least in the 80s, maybe beforehand. Let me see what year Kraft's book is from. His book is not that old. It came out in the 2000s, I think. 2008. 2008. We are lucky that he put this on paper when he did, because I think he actually died in 2018, either 2017 or 2018. He passed away only recently, but good thing he finished this before he did. So we owe this man a debt of gratitude, and this goes back so much further than we think. There's something called Banting's Letter on Corpulence, which was from the mid-1800s, which was a man that was not a doctor. He was an undertaker. He was not a physician. He was an overweight man who discovered that, or I think maybe his doctor had told him that, hey, you could lose weight by cutting out sugar and starch and beer. You know, eat fatty meat, eat low starch vegetables, you know, maybe have some wine, have some liquor now and then, but not the beer. So this is not new. It's nothing new. And if you really want to learn how far back some of this sugar stuff goes, I recommend Gary Taubes' book, The Case Against Sugar. You have no doubt heard of Gary Taubes, right? So this isn't too blurry, right? Gary Taubes, The Case Against Sugar. His other, you know, really well-known book that is even bigger than this is Good Calories, Bad Calories. That is an excellent, excellent read. It is a very difficult read. It took me 3 tries before I finished the book. I started it, gave up, started it, gave up, started it, and made it all the way through. It was worth it, but it's not an easy read. And that book has a lot of the politics in it, and it has also the saturated fat and cholesterol stuff, whereas this book is really specific to the sugar issue. And Taubes talks about doctors as far back as the 1700s, 200 years ago, you know, more than 200 years ago, realizing that people that were eating a lot of sugar were getting hypertensive, they were having gout, they were putting on weight. And, you know, they had been eating fatty meat all along. They had been eating prosciutto in Italy. They had been eating lamb and grease. It wasn't the fatty meat that was the problem. What was new in the human diet? Or what was maybe not brand new, but being consumed in amounts that had never been consumed before, and in a degree of refining that had never been consumed before? It was the sugar. It was the little white crystals, and I'm not talking about salt. So if you want to really read some fascinating stuff about how far back doctors were observing this problem and sort of noting it, and it goes even further back. It goes to ancient Egypt, and I'll get to that in a minute, because the next guy that we need to mention is John Yadkin, and it's maybe hard to see. It's in a very light color. Yadkin, Yudkin, but his book is called Pure, White, and Deadly, and it came out, I want to say, I thought it was in the 60s. He was a British doctor, and he was doing his research in the 1960s. This book, it turns out, first came out in 1972, which you'll recall is the same year that Dr. Atkins' first book came out. Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution, 1972. So they were contemporaries. And Atkins, in fact, he mentions John Yadkin in this book, so he was well aware of that work. And you know, this is a new version with a foreword by Robert Lustig. You all know Robert Lustig from the fructose video. What does he call it? Like, is sugar toxic or whatever it is? Like, you know, he's sort of the fructose guy. And this book has another name. It's also called Sweet and Dangerous. It was published in Britain, I think, as Sweet and Dangerous. So you can find it as Pure, White, and Deadly or Sweet and Dangerous. It's the same book. And Yadkin also talking about gout, talking about people gaining weight, becoming obese, talking about diabetes, and talking about sugar, talking about even heart attack, thrombosis, coronary thrombosis, talking about so many other things. You know, I think I just said that heart attacks, cardiovascular disease, just not just whatever. They knew about this. And Yadkin was sort of, you all know who Ancel Keys is. Ancel Keys was the 7 countries study. He was the guy that sort of got the ball rolling and kept the ball rolling on the, you know, lipid hypothesis, the sort of like saturated fat is the dietary enemy, cholesterol is the dietary enemy. And at the same time that Ancel Keys was pushing that, Yadkin was like, no, I think it's the sugar. And all of the research and every single piece of data that I've seen says it's the sugar. And of course, Ancel Keys' philosophy prevailed, and it is only now starting to very, very slowly stop prevailing. But anyway, Yadkin was a contemporary of Ancel Keys, and so at the same time. Now, I said I would come back to ancient Egypt because even the sugar thing, it goes even further back than the 1700s. And You guys know who Michael Eades is and his wife Mary Dan Eades? They are both MDs. They are the author of Protein Power, and there's a book called Protein Power Life Plan. I think there's something called like The Cure for the Middle-Aged Middle. They've written several books, all of them great. This is one that I read not long after I read the Atkins book. Now, this Protein Power came out in, I think, 1996. Yeah, 1996. So also, you know, a couple of decades old at this point. And you would do pretty well to read this too, because like I said, I didn't mean to imply that Dr. Atkins was the only person talking about this at that time. Now, his book came out in 72, same year as Yadkin's book. You know, the Eades is sort of, it's EADES. I know you can't see it there. They came on the scene a little bit later, but you know, the reason I sort of celebrated Atkins was not only was that the way I got started, but I mentioned in that previous video that he was really the one that brought this to the masses first. And I guess Yadkin, you know, Yadkin tried with his book here, but it's all well and good for all that research to be done in the labs and in the whatever, in the universities. But if nobody's telling people about it, if nobody's telling the obese diabetic patient, if nobody's telling the woman with PCOS, if nobody's telling the man with BPH, if nobody's, you know, telling the hypertensive people and the people with insulin resistance, if nobody's bringing those critical research findings to the people that need it the most, what's the point? So I celebrate Atkins for bringing it to the people who needed it. And I'm trying to do that with my Alzheimer's book. It's called The Alzheimer's Antidote. You can find it on Amazon. What good do these fascinating discoveries do us when nobody's translating the scientific gobbledygook for the caregiver of somebody with Alzheimer's? Anyway, that's my own separate topic. Let's get back to the doctors Eades, Dr. Michael and Mary Dan. I'll have links to their website down below because Dr. Eades, Mike Eades, writes a really incredible blog. He's not really active blogging anymore, but go back through his archives. It's gold. It is all worth a read. A blog post could be 3 years old, 5, 8 years old, worth reading because he's just a rock star. I've had the privilege of meeting him and Mary Dan at some conferences, and it's just, they're great. And I wanted to point out, I haven't read this book in many years, but just a few minutes ago, prior to recording this video, I was like, let me just flip through this to see what they were talking about. Like, were they all over things, you know, over 2 decades ago, like Atkins was? Or, so guess what? They were well aware of John Yadkin's work. It's probably very blurry on the video, but do you see John Yadkin, MD there? Yep, at the top. I'm going to read it because I see it's blurry. The dedication, they dedicated their book to Yadkin, to British physician John Yadkin, MD, PhD, who was fighting the good fight before we were born. So they knew all about Yadkin. And I've got, you know, they were talking about hyperinsulinemia. They're talking about triglycerides. They're talking about it all. And I little earmark, you can see, I have so many pages dog-eared here, like all throughout. I don't have highlighting, but it's all dog-eared. And he's, you know, how often do I say, or maybe I don't say it a lot in my videos, I blog about it all the time, that obesity and gaining weight is not the cause of type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease or PCOS or any of that other stuff that is associated with obesity now. Obesity is the result of the same metabolic disturbance, the same metabolic imbalance that causes type 2 diabetes and PCOS and cardiovascular disease and gout and hypertension and all that other stuff. Obesity is yet just one more effect, and they say exactly frigging that. They go blah, 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 blah. This view holds that as a person develops upper body obesity, the hypertension, glucose intolerance, and excess triglycerides start to become evident, leading to the conclusion that upper body obesity causes these disorders. It makes sense. First you get fat, then you develop all these other problems. Therefore, the excess fat must be causing them, right? and they're mentioning this other doctor they're talking about, when Dr. Kaplan examined the data closely, he found that upper body obesity is not necessarily the cause of the other three, but is simply found in conjunction with them most of the time. And I'm so glad they said most of the time, because what do I always talk about? You can have high triglycerides, you can have hypertension, you can have diabetes without being overweight. You can be at a normal weight and have all of that same stuff. Okay. He goes on to demonstrate that hyperinsulinemia, which has been found to coexist with each of these conditions, can be more realistically represented as the root cause of upper body obesity, glucose intolerance, hypertension, and excess triglycerides. The deadly quartet of his article's title. Excess body fat, the first thing most people notice, doesn't come first. It comes after and as a result of the hyperinsulinemia. And it's funny that I had this page dog-eared anyway. Like I said, I haven't read this book in I don't know how many years. But it's interesting, I must have recognized the hyperinsulinemia thing, because I did read this after the Atkins book, and if you watch that previous video, I mentioned how shocked I was when I read this Atkins book again for the first time in over a decade, how much he harps on the hyperinsulinemia, not the high glucose, the high insulin. And so it might be that by the time I read Protein Power, I was starting to learn more about insulin and understanding that, but I don't know, maybe I actually dog-eared her for something else that I didn't see. But, I mean, the inevitability of this health progression, first hyperinsulinemia, followed by any or all of the related disorders, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, may not be pleasant to contemplate, but you can take comfort in the fact that if all have one root cause and we can effectively deal with that single troublemaker, we can solve them all at once. And isn't that exactly precisely what we see when people with metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance go on a low-carb or ketogenic diet? Because what is insulin resistance? What defines the metabolic syndrome? What are some of the diagnostic criteria? Hypertension, diabetes, yeah, high fasting glucose, high blood pressure, obesity, and not just obesity. Part of the official diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome is a large waist circumference, so specifically that abdominal obesity, that apple shape. And it says heart disease, two more of the official diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome, high triglycerides and low HDL. And if we consider that a major biomarker for heart disease, we have that right there. And so guess what? The Eades, the doctor's Eades are saying if all of those things are caused by the same root cause, the hyperinsulinemia, and we take care of that one root cause, we fix them all. And don't we see that when people go keto or go low carb? The blood sugar gets better, the blood pressure gets better, the HDL rises in like most people. There's a very small percentage of people that the HDL doesn't rise, but the triglycerides sink like a stone. You can practically set your watch by it. It's so predictable. They lose weight. Like all of these great things happen because you're addressing the chronically high insulin. When you stop eating the foods that, affect insulin the most, you're going to reduce the insulin. You're going to fix all the problems that are being caused by high insulin. Now, before I forget, what does this have to do with ancient Egypt? I said with Yadkin in the 60s and Taubes talking about doctors reporting all of these things starting to happen in the 1700s. And I said, no, this has been known since ancient Egypt. I will have a link to a video Dr. Mike Eades did on what he called Paleopathology. And he goes back, now this is maybe since the Paleolithic era, he goes back to ancient Egypt and talks about how they can tell that some of these mummies, I mean, these people are mummified now, but they had obesity. They had rampant tooth decay. I'm not sure how they determined this, because the soft tissue, I assume, is like all dead and all that's left is bones, or maybe because they're mummified, some of that was preserved. They can tell that these ancient Egyptian people had atherosclerosis. They had clogged arteries. Now, in ancient Egypt, they were doing a lot of grain. the breadbasket, like that part of the world, the Middle East, like that is the breadbasket. And it's just really fascinating that even back then. Now, back then, they didn't have grape jam. They didn't have high fructose corn syrup. They didn't have sugar sweetened sodas. You know, they didn't have, I don't even know what else, like all this. They didn't have the kind of maple syrup we have now, where like the syrup that's just corn syrup that's colored to look like maple syrup. But they had bread, they had wheat, you know, they had grain, and they were baking it. And it's, anyway, that video is just really fascinating. I really recommend it. And you know, any video from Dr. Eades is going to be dynamite. You can just go to YouTube, put in Michael Eades, Eades, and you will come up with a wealth of stuff that you will want to watch, because he's just brill. And by brill, I mean brilliant. So that's kind of it. I just, like I said, wanted to do this follow-up, and I know like 90% of the people that watch the first video are not going to watch this one. That's fine, but I just would feel remiss. I would feel bad if I didn't call attention to all of these other researchers, like Dr. Kraft, like the Eades, like John Yadkin, and even Gary Taubes. You know, he's a journalist and a writer. He's not a scientist or a an MD, but he is uncovering all of this stuff that has been known for centuries and centuries, and he's sort of bringing that information to the masses. He has a book coming out in the spring of 2020, I think, so that'll be good to have on the radar. But yeah, as I love Dr. Atkins, I'm so appreciative of his work, but let's not forget all of these other key people who, you know, whose work, if it had been listened to when it was published, when they were trying to tell the world about it, if we had listened to them, if we had listened to Dr. Atkins, we would not be in the epidemics that we're in. We would not be in this unprecedented, staggering health crisis that so many of us are in. But that is it. As always, like I said, don't forget the links. My website is twoatnutrition.com, and I guess that's it. I'll have links to all of these books. All of these books will be down there. You can check them out. And remember to come see us in Beaufort, North Carolina. Remember, Jackie Eberstein is going to be there. Jackie Eberstein was the head nurse at the Atkins Center for Complementary Medicine. She is the fountain of information. Oh, speaking of fountain of information, we're not done yet. I do want to give more credit to Dr. Stephen Phinney. Stephen Phinney is, I'm sure that you know who he is, or you've heard his name. I have 2 of his books in the back. I'm not going to get up again, but he's written a couple of books. And he has been doing research on this at least since the early 1980s. I know I've read at least one of his papers from 1983. Now, I was 5 years old in 1983. I was only 5, and this man was publishing research on the ketogenic diet. At that time, he was not into the, obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome stuff, probably because those things were nowhere near as prevalent. Even only as far back as the 80s, they were nowhere near as skyrocketing as they are now. His research started in the athletic field. He was looking at fat adaptation and keto adaptation for endurance cyclists back then. So anyway, like I did mention briefly in the last video that Dr. Atkins mentions Stephen Phinney in here, which was really cool to see. And we owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Phinney, and he's done a lot of research together with Dr. Westman and Dr. Jeff Volek, and of course he's with Virta Health now. I'm gonna shut up because I'm just going on and on. But anyway, Dr. Phinney is still very, very active in clinical research and getting the stuff published. So this is not a joke. We're not making this up. It's not 1 or 2 crazy kooks on the internet, on the YouTubes, talking about this crazy high-fat, low-carb diet. It's medical doctors, it's PhDs, it's thousands upon thousands of people changing their lives at this point. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.